Thanks for taking the time, Patrick. When I first saw the title of your book, I said, "Wow, this is a really smart marketing move." With Apple, the most powerful brand, and China, sort of, the second largest economy. And and if I ever write a book, I think I'll reach out to you for some book title ideas. But there's another book that I really liked, which was How to Make a Few $1 Billion by Brad Jacobs, and was an amazing book. And so I thought, let me take the risk of not being disappointed, because the title already sets the bar very high. So how do you come up with the title, and sort of, what was the process?
I mean, the title is actually kind of boring, right? Apple in China. I mean, it's just the two entities that we're discussing. It doesn't necessarily have a great, origin story. I mean, I was already the Apple reporter for the Financial Times, and it was just the realization that we being the media, weren't really ever covering, how the sausage gets made. Insofar as there has been a story about Apple in China over the last 20 years, it has just been about the tedium of the jobs, right? That it is not a great job to work 12 hours a day, potentially 60 hours a week, assembling these units on a conveyor belt system. But if it's so obviously a terrible job, or if it's so obvious that Apple is exploiting these Chinese workers, the obvious question was, well, why would Beijing allow that? And the answer, of course, is technology transfer on a totally epic scale. That China is, in effect, getting more out of this relationship than Apple is, especially the longer time frame you look. In other words, stock market, gains or dividends to shareholders are to a narrow group of people, and they're not lasting, right? They're ethereal, if you will. Money is, fungible. The training, the know-how, the experiential knowledge of how to build world-class products at world-leading scale, that is the stuff that nations are built upon. So there's like this asymmetry where, yes, Apple has become the world's largest company through its relationship with China, but China has become the world's leader in advanced electronics manufacturing by having Apple and all these other companies, but really Apple foremost among them, for reasons that we'll get into, having them in their country. So, I sort of flipped the script on Apple negotiators or Apple engineers would really be sort of surprised in the early 2000s at just how willing Chinese entrepreneurs, workers, local officials would be in bending over backwards to win Apple's orders and then fulfill them as requested, really as demanded. And you get this sense that, wow, aren't we powerful? And my argument is you weren't that powerful. You were being lured by the siren call of an emerging superpower who was doing with the skills, finding different ends than just what you were training them to do. So that's sort of the essence of the narrative. We'll have to unpack that quite a bit in the next hour.
Yeah. So basically, that they sort of got played, or they were playing a short-term game while the Chinese were playing a longer-term game. But yeah, before we unpack that, let's just throw some light on you. I think it'd be nice to sort of get to know what made you who you are today. For me, it's a lot, dinner table conversations growing up, and that kind of stuff. For you, it might have been something different. Be really nice to hear, what kind of what sort of formed you and made you who you are today.
Yeah, we're not a family of engineers, certainly not a family of technologists. I grew up in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. My parents met at divinity school. I'm the youngest of three brothers, and literally every person in my family has a degree, if not two, in religious studies. Now, I'm an atheist and sort of always have been. So when I say religious studies, I really mean the anthropology of religion. I like looking at different cultures, or indeed history or art history, through the lens of religion. I find that fascinating. And 4 years of that, I got really nerdy and just really geeked out. I mean, one time I wrote an essay for a class that wasn't even assigned. I stayed up all night because I got this idea at 8 p.m. and was finished at 7 a.m. Didn't know what to do with it, so I just sent it to the TA. But that's how into university I got. The trouble is nobody needs religion grads, right? There's no classified section that's like early Christian historians, like in demand, And so journalism was sort of the natural outcome, because really what I liked, if you think about it, is just reading, writing, thinking. So I sort of fell into journalism out of, I don't know, a bit of happenstance and a bit out of like, desperation is too harsh, but like I didn't have any other skills. So that's the only real thing I could do.
Um, yeah, no, that's a cool story, and I think then what makes you get so. sort of this is how you became who you are, but like right now, what makes you wake up every morning? Do you have some sort of, what's your engine, right? Do you have some sort of vision you're working towards? Do you have some other set of values that drive you? Like, what keeps you going?
So I'm very lazy in any sort of like entrepreneurial sense. I can never really start something and maintain it, and I certainly don't want people working for me or anything like that. But the value of journalism is that you're like a perpetual grad student. Effectively, you're always learning. And I love just learning new stuff. I really prefer the reading and the research than the writing. But the writing is sort of the natural consequence of actually sort of putting into the world what it is that you've learned. But the book, I mean, it took me about 2.5 years if you include really everything. But really, it was in a 12-month process where I would say 8 months was just doing 2 to 3 hour interviews with as many people as I could, more than 200 with Apple experience, including some that are still there. So that for 8 months, and then 4 months of just total burst of writing. So more focus was on the research than the writing, and then I lived nocturnally to get the writing done. So I've got little kids, and so when they had breakfast, I would have dinner. When they had dinner, I would have breakfast. When they were at school, I was asleep all day, and when they were asleep, I was downtown at a WeWork, the only person there, just compiling all of my notes together and writing and just having the freedom of nobody's bothering you at 4 in the morning. You're not getting emails, certainly not running into people. But that was sort of my happy space for writing, and it all got done in that totally bizarre window when, I don't know, I don't think it works for other people. It's not something I would recommend, but for the longest time, going back to that university essay story, like 2 in the morning with no distractions is my most creative period, for better or for worse. I sort of wish that wasn't the case, but it is.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that, because personally, you hear about all these people waking up at 4 a.m. and doing their workouts and sort of starting early.
Yeah.
And sometimes my body clock just doesn't tick that way. And so it's nice to hear that I'm not alone.
Mine is so different that sometimes I would finish up work downtown at 6 a.m. and then I'd put my laptop in a running bag and I would run 6 or 7 miles home, with big flashing
Nice.
lights and stuff to make sure that I wasn't, like hit by anybody, because it's, downtown San Francisco at times. So yeah, no, I'm the total opposite of Tim Cook, I guess, who the reputation is that he wakes up at 4:30 every day, checks emails, and then goes and
And
does a
works out.
workout. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think the intensity and obsession is sort of similar. So I think that, and the book really
Yeah.
kind of shows
The
that, right?
perfectionist quality, maybe.
Um,
Yeah, perhaps.
Yeah. No, but I think now let's. So I thought we divide our discussion in two parts, sort of Apple and China, and China and Apple. And so let's start with the Apple and China part,
Sure.
which is, how Apple had sort of their unique outsourcing strategy, where they really, basically held their suppliers by the balls, right? Like they had complete leverage, and the way they did that is, as you write in the book, is they didn't own the factories, but they basically owned the equipment and sort of orchestrated all the production processes. And when you have this crazy story where I think Foxconn was trying to renegotiate something, and Apple just sent in their engineers. They just bolted the expensive machinery off and put it on trucks to send it out, just to make sure the suppliers get the message that they're in charge.
Yeah, in broad
And sort of
daylight, this was
ironically,
considered just like a big middle finger to Foxconn in the middle of negotiations.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's essentially, they colonized their suppliers of sorts, because they had a better understanding of the costs of the suppliers. Like they would negotiate the stuff that the suppliers were using themselves. And I like the quote where one of where Apple was basically like a prom queen, beautiful to look at but a nightmare to date.
Yes.
And which really brings up the sort of key argument you make around why suppliers continued to work with Apple, which is they were, while Apple was having the leverage in the short term and squeezing out margins and making life so hard for the suppliers. I think the suppliers seem to all have, or the only suppliers drawn to Apple are the ones that are playing the longer game, and sort of that are seeing this almost like grad school, right? Where
Yeah.
they're kind of trying to learn as much as possible and try to make money elsewhere.
This great quote that I ended up not using, I think I might have put it in a magazine article, but it's not in the book. But someone told me from Apple, they said there was the sense that working with Apple was a reward, not a business, right? And the sense in which they're getting at is what I call the Apple squeeze. This is sort of my coinage of how Apple negotiates. So they would say to their supplier, look, you're really not going to earn much margin from us. You might even lose money, and in a great scenario, maybe you're getting 2% margins if you're ultra efficient. But we are going to train the hell out of your entire workforce, and the skills that you will gain will be so valuable that you'll be able to go use them for somebody else. And so, another manufacturing design engineer told me, we offered training second to none. Another person called it the Ivy League equivalent of hardware engineering. And, you know, I don't know that this question is answerable, but I don't think that this was like a full out strategy. This is just sort of how it happened. And it really begins, I mean, to some extent, there is a DNA of this, and you have it in the earlier outsourcing that Apple did for like the laser printer in 1985. And I sort of tell that narrative. And it happens with the iPod as well, or sorry, the Newton, but then also with the iPod. But essentially, where it really comes to fruition was with the translucent iMac in 1998, 1999, where they're building it with LG and Korea. And Apple wanted to build it itself, but they didn't have the means to create a CRT, cathode ray tube, which is sort of like the decades old technology for building monitors. So LG was their monitor supplier, and so Apple wanting to basically build a computer that was going to be sexy, but was in essence sort of just a monitor with a computer stuffed inside, if you could think of it like that. They had to rely on
I,
their
I used one of those as a kid.
yeah, I
So
did too. I had it
um,
when I was a late teenager. In Tangerine, what fruit did you have?
I think ours were sort of weird greenish,
Yeah.
this kind of, yeah. I don't even know how to describe it. It was some sort of
Well,
turquoise
you might have had the
with,
original, which was
yeah,
Bondi Blue, which is sort of blue and green together, and then
correct. Yeah,
and
I
then it
think
became
that's, yeah,
Blueberry, which was you have to be in the ID department at Apple to really show the difference between ID and or between Blueberry and sorry and Bondi Blue. I forget what the green one was called.
or it was the blue green one. I don't
Yeah,
remember.
so
It
you
was
probably
a
had the
long
first
time
one, the
back.
Bondi Blue. So okay, so nobody knows how to make that computer. Apple begins to know how to make it, but they of course don't have the scale, and so they begin sending product designers and manufacturing design engineers over to Korea to teach the Koreans how to actually do this, and including not just like what parts and components we're going to use, but innovating on those parts and components and actually doing the production processes behind that. And that ends up being so successful that they basically eventually train Foxconn how to do it as well. And there's a whole history as to why Foxconn comes on board that'll be in the book. But that's really the origins where they're going over all the time. So yes, there's this earlier history where Apple engineers were flying to places like Tokyo to work in factories, but the scale, the frequency with which they're doing it really comes when Steve Jobs returns to the company and they're building the iMac. And then China just becomes like the country that is doing the most in terms of industrial policy, in terms of tax exempt bonded zones where you could build this stuff, in terms of 12-hour working days with just like what felt at the time like an unending faucet of people that were just like coming over from the hinterlands and working for less than 50 cents an hour. And so just everything consolidates into China. But that's like a 7-year narrative involving 8 or 9 different countries before China really wins out. And that was a pretty untold narrative. I mean, nobody knows that the translucent iMac was made in Mexicali, in Wales, in the Czech Republic. Nobody really knows about operations that Foxconn had in Fullerton, California. So there's all sorts of fun stories that lead you up into what I call siren song consolidation into China. But the missing topography wasn't just China in our Apple history. It was these engineers who were flying over to Asia to train, equip with machinery and sort of teach everybody in the supply chain. And the significance of Foxconn, which is a company everyone sort of associates with Apple, is that the founder, Terry Guo, really is the first person to understand, like, Apple doesn't have big volumes and we're certainly not making a lot of money, but my God, are they teaching us skills that are valuable so that we can take them beyond the Apple partnership.
Yeah, it's Uncle Terry, right? If I remember correctly,
Yeah, I
right?
believe
That's
it
what he's
was
called.
John Rubinstein, Johnny Ive's boss and the head of hardware, and someone that worked with Steve Jobs at a couple different companies who called him Uncle Terry. I'm not sure exactly why. I think it was just that he was sort of avuncular, so he got that name. But yeah. So Apple has, I think, even to today, calls him Uncle Terry.
Yeah, and I think it like probably he sort of represents the early supplier really understanding the game about, they're teaching us something and we're going to use it. And you speak about all these countries Apple was manufacturing in before they consolidated everything in China. And I think you could make an argument that it's almost like Apple was asking them to do what was saying, okay, we have this leverage on you short term, but we're teaching you all this, and the next logical step is obviously that they lose the leverage long term. So what I'm trying to get at is how much of this is really, China being a super strategic long term player trying to dominate the world, and how much is it just Apple playing the short game, optimizing, sort of their payoff function for the short term. And the logical consequence, or sort of the flip side of that, is that in the long term, you basically lose leverage, because obviously if you're continuously teaching and upgrading and making everyone else better, especially your suppliers, what else will they do? They have to earn their margin somewhere.
So this is where there's a certain blind spot or myopia on the part of Apple, which is that they really weren't thinking about the geopolitical implications. And you can understand that because, I mean, even when Apple comes out with the iPhone in 2007, 2008, it is just not that big of a company. I mean, Steve Jobs' original goal is to have 1% of the smartphone market, right? So you're not going to be thinking, are we accidentally up-arming an entire country? I mean, it's a ludicrous proposition. I mean, people sort of think it sounds ludicrous when I say it now. So when people were thinking about this 17, 18 years ago, they wouldn't have been thinking about that. And my favorite quote in the book, right, is somebody telling me over coffee, are you sure you're not overthinking your thesis? You keep telling me about geopolitics, but I will tell you, I was there in the early 2000s when we were setting up the supply chain in China, and we weren't thinking about geopolitics at all. The next paragraph is one word,
But
and it says precisely.
yeah. But I think, yeah, to be fair, no one was really. I
No.
think China had joined the WTO. It was all, I mean, I remember the mad optimism about China, BRICS, etc., but especially China, especially in the early 2000s, all the way, beyond the financial crisis. It was all everyone, like, you couldn't say something bad about China at that point. And I feel now the narrative has completely flipped, which is,
Yes.
no one wants to be seen as saying something good about China.
So
And so this lack of nuance is really annoying, right? And I think that's something that I want to unpack with you, right? Because there are a lot of things as an author you just can't put in a book; it would make it unreadable. So it would be nice to sort of have you reflect and unpack that.
well,
What's going on? Like, this binary switch.
I'm glad you brought this up just because I say that there are no villains in my narrative. If there's an indictment of anything, it's shareholder first capitalism, and we can talk about that. But I don't, condemn anyone at Apple for not realizing that China was not going to become the next great democracy. That was everyone's thinking. I mean, it wasn't even a bipartisan thing, it was an American worldview thing. Everybody thought that. And I still hold out like the possibility of an alternate reality where that did happen. But a lot of things happened in the 2000s that you wouldn't have anticipated, namely, September 11th, and America really taking its sort of geopolitical lens and focusing not on Asia, but on the Middle East for, basically 25 years, right? I mean, this is ongoing today. And the financial crisis, right? Lehman Brothers. And so China is just able to take advantage of the fact that, like, nobody's really paying attention as they become a total manufacturing superpower. And that, I would say, is even accelerated during COVID. Someone like Tom Friedman of the New York Times would frequently go to China, basically wasn't able to go there for 5 years because of COVID. And by the time he went back earlier this year, he was like, my God, have they become good at advanced electronics manufacturing. And there's a certain stage at which, for Apple's like lost some control during COVID. I realize we're accelerating to the narrative here. We can always come back. But, Apple used to send 500 people out just for a new iPhone launch, just to sort of make sure everything was going on in the factories as they intended it to. During COVID, you couldn't have those people. You at best, you could get 30 to 50 people because you were having to fly from private jets going from San Jose to Alaska. And this is all part of the story. But after COVID was, quote unquote, over, and those flights could resume, I lazily assumed that Apple, of course, resumed them, and it was back to the base model of what they've been doing for the quarter century. But it didn't. My understanding from people that still work there is that once Apple's Chinese teams had proven that they could basically take on what Cupertino used to teach them, you didn't need to ramp back up to 500 people. Like, the Chinese teams can take care of it now. And that's great for Apple's margins. That's great for Apple's operational efficiency. But it means that the experiential know-how in the minds of the people within Cupertino doing the designs and everything else, they're like no longer there. They're retiring. They're moving on. A lot of them are actually going to Johnny Ive's startup. And so there's like this loss of control that frankly worries me over the next 5-10 years for, medium-term outlook for Apple. I'm going off on a couple of tangents, so I'll let you redirect the conversation.
No, of course, I think that and it kind of, it's almost the opposite of what Apple initially set out to do by control, by by not outsourcing like everyone else, where they just gave up control. They really kept control all through.
Yes.
And I think what you're just saying is basically now they're essentially losing their grip on that, right?
And not to go too deep into the history here, but it's just worth knowing that, Apple was founded by two guys named Steve in a garage in 1976. And it's not so much the philosophy, just like the ethos, just the necessity at the time that you had to build your own computers. I mean, there is no electronic supply chain. So, of course, what Steve Wozniak brings to the table is he can unassemble a computer, disassemble a computer, improve the circuit board literally through his own tinkering, his own hands, put it back together faster. And Steve Jobs sort of recognizes the brilliance of his friend, recognizes the sort of how Moore's law is going to shape the computing industry, and begins to have this bicycle for the mind moment of like, oh my God, computers are going to change everything. And he's got this marketing prowess, this ability to speak behind him. And that's really the founding of Apple Computer. The companies that come around in 1985, I believe that's like when Dell comes on board, they're all cloning the IBM PC. They're not thinking about the graphical user interface. They're not thinking about the operating system. Everyone's using Windows. Everyone's using Intel chips. They're not tinkerers in the way that Wozniak was, and they're not visionaries in the sense that Jobs was. So they begin to all compete on boring stuff: logistics, distribution, manufacturing efficiency, stuff that Steve Jobs never really cared that much about. He went through bouts of really caring about this stuff, but on the whole, that was not what drove him. You asked what wakes me up in the morning. Manufacturing efficiency is not what woke up Steve Jobs in the morning. So there's a different ethos for those companies in the late 80s. So they are the ones who really begin to outsource everything. I mean, computer companies are born with the idea that we can outsource all of this to Taiwan. And the Taiwanese actually sort of take on not just the manufacturing, but the R&D, the design. And so you really don't have a Johnny Ive equivalent at any of these companies. And they do so well in these kind of boring respects, right? This is what like Apple was referring to with like the Orwellian Big Brother monotony of the IBM world, that Apple is nearly bankrupt in 1996. And the history of how they come out of that, the Hail Mary pass that they throw to get Steve Jobs to come back to the company, is all the first part of the book called Saving Apple. And it's this pretty fascinating narrative. And it might sound like, oh, well, this is the narrative we know, and so I'm just taking from other books or something. Maybe 20% that, but the other 80% is really telling it through a manufacturing lens, because you've got to understand that the reason why Apple does better than everybody else when they adopt outsourcing is that they don't really outsource in any traditional sense. They outsource in a manner where it's like they own the factories, even though they don't own the factories. The level of control they take is not just sending blueprints over to Asia, it's sending plane loads of engineers over to Asia, and they really dictate everything that's going on. Some of the manufacturing design engineers, I should say, would say that they see through a glass darkly. In other words, Apple sort of believes it has more control than they actually do, but that's sort of getting into the weeds. For the most part, they are taking unprecedented control of the supply network down multiple tiers. And as you alluded to, like they often know more about manufacturing than the manufacturers themselves, and they're just in this position of growing power as their volumes just explode to the degree that by 2011, when Steve Jobs dies, Apple's the most valuable company on the planet.
Yeah, and I think what you also really sort of unpack in the book is that it's not just one or two technologies, it's really every component of the iPhone, right? I mean, if we take the iPhone as an example, it's like the glass, it's every, nut and bolt inside, like the smallest of things. They maintain super good control. And one thing that was interesting was where you speak about how they go to Japan and they go to Germany and to Switzerland,
Yeah.
and look at other industries. Like I think it was luxury watches and jewelry or something like that, and they sort of learn from there and bring those practices into their product development and manufacturing process.
So this is a massive point, and it's funny because like you could probably write a book on that, and I think in this book it's a paragraph, maybe it's two paragraphs. But yeah, they have these subject matter experts. I mean, these are basically PhDs in things like chemistry and just like niche processes in the manufacturing world. And yeah, their goal is like, what could be next for the iPhone in terms of components or processes, and what can we not find in China? So they would go to these sectors like like factories that are making Rolex watches or something in Switzerland, in Germany, in Japan, places where automation and robotics are world leading, and they would sign private deals to sort of get some technology, and then they would scale the hell out of it in China. I mean, I don't know how many Rolex watches are made per year, but Apple's making 230 million iPhones. So if you take a sort of process that was big in the luxury watch world, but then you build it for the iPhone, I mean, the technology transfer taking place is not just from America to China. That is not the story. It is from around the world to China. And as ludicrous as that sounds, just think about the leverage that Apple has. Think about the brand equity that it has. If you're a Swiss watchmaker, are you rejecting the meeting of Apple coming to your factory because they want to sign a deal with you? I mean, they've got more money than they know what to do with. It's very enticing for everybody involved. And this is where I don't actually talk about this, but the economic jargon is negative externalities, right? Two parties can have a great relationship, but then there's like collateral damage. In other words, people that are not part of the process, not part of the partnership, they are the ones that get impacted. And that's why the best reviews of the book have understood, in a sense, the subtext. I don't believe I ever say this explicitly, but the context of the book, the thesis of the book, is Apple has not just created a conundrum for itself, it's created a conundrum for the United States because they,
And for the world.
and for the world, because they played such a role up-arming America's biggest rival in like the most important thing for Xi Jinping, which is advanced electronics industry, that I don't know that anybody is going to be able to keep up with them. And all you need to think about is what else could advanced electronics industry build? And it's drones, it's military weaponry, it's all kind of things that of course Apple has no control over. And so, I mean, where this argument goes is so big that I am still struggling to digest it. And I'm already getting readers from like the biotech industry who are saying, we're in an earlier stage of partnering more with China, and we're reading your book and realizing we need to make a big strategic pivot because of and like my point is just like I did not consider that. I wasn't thinking about other industries and how they would read it. I was just burrowing in my own little Abbott rabbit hole the last 2 years. But that is a good reading of the book. I mean, to realize the implications here are world shaking is a strange place for a single corporate history to go. But again, Apple's worth $3 to $4 trillion, depending on where you look at it the last 6 months. I mean, it is on the level of a nation state in terms of how big it is. So it's one of these things where if you take a 90-second sound clip where I've said one of these things, I sound like I'm totally unhinged. And then people get to the end of the book and they're like, it's actually kind of common sense when you think about it. And that is sort of where I want you to get. I mean, I just sort of handhold you to tell you this 25, 30-year history, but it's not a diatribe. It's not a screed. It's not a polemic. It's not a big argument. I just show you what happened. And I've had very few people read the book and find themselves in stark disagreement. They might disagree with little details or whatever, but like all I'm really showing you is just how dramatic the impact is of having Apple operations in your country. I don't know what the counter argument is. Nobody could say that they didn't have a bigger impact than Dell or something. Of course they did.
Yeah, and I think if we look sort of left and right along with Apple, I think you speak a bit about Tesla and sort of what how they were sort of. You use this phrase, I think that sounds like very sort of China bashing or almost sort of unnecessary, like sort of black and white provocative, which is that Tesla did the same for EVs, right? By trading suppliers, they were sort of this catfish for Chinese EV brands. And do you want to first just describe what that means, being a catfish in the context of fish breeding, and then speak about Tesla, and please speak about Volkswagen, and because I think you covered Volkswagen too, so if you can speak a bit about the automotive industry, especially with large German company, that'd be nice to sort of round up what else is going on along with Apple.
So I realize the logo for the book is a dragon eating the apple. I get that. It's a great logo. I mean, I freaking love the cover. But the stark red colors and stuff, I think, get people to think, oh, this is a real anti-China book. I would argue it's not really an anti-China book. It is grappling with the, in some cases, superiority of state-led capitalism and a country the size of China. So even if you don't think it's like a strategic adversary, it's at least a rival to America. I mean, of course it is. There's no counter argument there. And the size of China is such that if they deem any area a strategic necessity, the power and impact of China getting into that area means that all other rival nations face deindustrialization as a serious prospect. I mean, that's just how big Apple is. So you don't have to hate the CCP or anything like that. I think the more you're scared by China, the more impactful my thesis is. But I'm not all that anti-China. If anything, I'm envious of many of the things they've come up with. And a fair bit of ink is spilled just on the idea of China turning, bureaucrats into sort of dynamic actors who actually don't just sort of like set up environmental roadblocks, let's say, as they do in the West, but actually sort of sit on your board, seek avenues for growth. I mean, there's a great piece just 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, by Kyle Chan in the New York Times, a guest essay, where he basically says, if you look at the trajectory of things, the U.S. is going to be irrelevant at some point in electronics, where it's going to be Hangzhou versus Suzhou or versus Shenzhen, rather than China versus the U.S. That's wildly in tune with my thesis. I mean, I do think that's sort of where things are going, and in a sense, my what I'm bringing to the table is the role that Apple played in that. But you asked a question about Volkswagen and Tesla, so I'm just sort of I don't like the idea that it's anti-China, so that's why I'm sort of spending a minute going through that. Okay, the catfish effect. This is something wildly discussed in China, in the Chinese newspapers, state-backed papers, etc. The idea is that the EV sector in China was struggling and they needed Tesla to play the role of the catfish. So some Norwegian folklore here is that sardines caught at sea and then brought into Norway, if they're kept alive somehow, the texture and flavor of them is better and therefore they fetch more money. The problem is you put sardines in a tank and you go back to shore, they all die. They become sedentary, they stop fighting for survival, and they die. So this Norwegian fisherman, this is a myth, I have no idea if this actually happened, realized that if you put a catfish in the tank, yeah, it might eat some of them, but the sardines will basically fight for survival, right? It's basically a Darwinian experiment. So by taking them back through with the catfish, the fisherman's able to get more money. So in Mandarin, the catfish effect, the way the Chinese use it, is that if we have Tesla come in as a sort of predator, it will in effect inspire all our local car makers to become better. Now, I love this analogy, but I think it's wrong. What it's getting wrong is that Tesla is operating with the Cook model or the Apple model, whereby it's not that the others are getting better through inspiration. It's far more direct than that. It's that even though Tesla does a bunch of manufacturing itself, it localizes the supply chain and it chases quality in the same way that Apple does. Other companies chase cost. Apple chases quality, so does Tesla. And to get the quality when it doesn't exist, you go and you train the factories. So Tesla literally, for the Shanghai Gigafactory, is able to get all these like state-backed subsidies from the provincial government and so forth to set up a factory in just 12 months. And in a sense, the quid pro quo is that they're going to train the suppliers in their ecosystem who then use those skills to improve the rest of the EV sector. To set this plan into motion, Tesla literally hires a bunch of people with Apple experience in China because they're the ones who sort of know how this works and can work with the public officials and so forth. So yeah, the idea is, can Tesla do for the EV sector what Apple did for the smartphone industry? And it's exactly what happens. I mean, I was a German auto reporter in the late 2010s, and the threat that China was going to be a major player in EVs was a non-story the entire time I was there. The first Teslas are made in China in 2019, and within a few years, it's President Biden, never mind tariff man, who's putting 100% tariffs on the Chinese EVs. So that is the impact that Tesla has. So you could say, oh, that's just Chinese ingenuity and they're coming up with stuff, and BYD's been around for a long time. Well, yeah, not successfully. They're only really successful once Tesla goes in there. And so maybe you have a different thesis, but it's quite the coincidence that EVs have been a major sector with lots of state subsidies, with dozens and indeed hundreds of companies since 2001, but they're not successful until 24 months after Tesla has improved the whole supply chain. And then they're becoming so dominant that like this is a big worry in Europe, a big worry in North America, and so forth. That was my
Yeah,
long
sort
answer.
of, yeah, no, I think it's a great answer. I just want to sort of double down on the geopolitical element here. So, I mean, I was, speaking to Will Wilkes and Chris Wright. I think Will, you know from earlier,
Oh, yeah, yeah. Broken
and
Republic.
correct, Broken Republic, and I think in German it's totally kaput. And sort of they're speaking about, about how Germany's model essentially is broken, and sort of one key argument they make is that in Germany it's the tail leading the dog, right? Basically, German national interests at the federal level and especially in terms of foreign policy are articulated based on business interests, right? So, I mean, even me as a German today, I don't see clearly articulated national interests independent of German big business, right? So it's whatever is good for business. Oh, we need cheap gas. Okay, we believe that bundle durch Handel, right? So like the more we trade, the better people will get, right? Oh, the Chinese market is lucrative, so Chinese are great people, and we can work together. And so I kind of get in the German context, right, based on this understanding of, look, the German state has never really post Second World War tried to articulate, let's say, an aggressive or like a an explicit set of national interests and positions and stood by them and spoken about them, etc. You see, it seems very opportunistic and very much driven by business interests. Feel free to riff, right, if you see this
Yeah,
differently.
let me
But
say
then what brings
two things. One, Made in China 2025 is the China program, is to some extent based on Berlin's program called Industry 4.0. So it's not that Germany has far more of an industrial policy and a history of industrial policy than America does, right? America's more just like laissez-faire and we'll let the entrepreneurs take care of things. What's good for the GM is going to be good for Washington, right? That was a saying in the 1950s. So I think I would give Berlin more credit there. But, and this will sound contradictory and perhaps it is to some degree, I think Germany as a country is in the same predicament that Apple as a company is in. In other words, Germany did incredibly well in the first 2 decades of the 21st century by really working closely with China. And they also seem to have not quite realized that by selling the best of their robotics and automation, and I suppose cars to the Chinese, they were helping all of that get built in China to such a degree that the Chinese are now their biggest rival in some of those things. And I was there when KUKA, KUKA, this sort of famously orange
it's in
robots.
Augsburg,
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
100 kilometers away from where I am. Yeah.
Exactly, and I met the CEO at the time. Can't think of his name at the moment. Maybe Thomas Muller. I'm not sure. And he, well, sorry, not he, but trying to purchase that company. And as you'll know better than me, I mean, there's all sorts of Mittelstand companies that either formed alliances with Chinese companies or were purchased by the Chinese companies. And sometimes you'd have these agreements that the company was going to stay German or keep the German branding or whatever. But like the story writ large is just one of technology transfer from Germany to China. It's very difficult to compete with China. Again, they are just so large. So Siemens played a role, building the high-speed rail system in China. And I haven't checked these figures, but my guess is that Siemens is not doing very well in terms of high-speed rail contracts in China today. And that's because the Chinese are world leading at it. They don't need Siemens anymore.
Yeah, no, and then and so that's why I wanted to bring it to Tesla, Elon Musk in the U.S. because you're based in San Francisco, and so like with Germany, okay, you argue there was some industrial policy, but clearly it wasn't as strategic as the Chinese. But what Elon Musk is clearly relatively influential, perhaps less now in the White House, but still, I think, an important voice. And given his sort of investments on the ground in China, how much of American national interests and policy will be driven and formulated by someone who owns assets there, and has a big stake in making sure the relationship works, or find a way sort of, because Tim Cook is not Trump's buddy, right? I think yes, they get along, etc., but not as openly, right? So how do you see this national interest, industrial policy, and private profit making sort of play out sort of?
This is a great question, and I don't want to pretend to predict the future, but let me just give some history, which is that the book's early chapters tell this story where the likes of IBM begin to outsource the building of their computers to companies like SCI, sort of the Foxconn of its day. Indeed, the company that really pioneered electronics contract manufacturing comes out of Huntsville, Alabama, was first known as Spacecraft Incorporated. And I argue that no alarm bells were going off when these deals happened, because if SCI purchased or sort of became the manufacturer of an IBM, the jobs weren't lost. And the know-how wasn't really lost. It was just moving from company to company. What happens, though, the sort of history of the PC in the 80s and 90s from a manufacturing perspective, is that the suppliers and the contract manufacturers are in massive competition with each other to win more orders, because you never make much margin in contract manufacturing, so volume is your goal. And there's all sorts of mergers throughout the 1990s, companies you've never heard of that are all getting together. But then they begin to move to Asia as a way of lowering their costs even further. And, like by the time this gets to Apple moving to Asia, people say that Tim Cook is the architect of the China strategy. And he's not. Nobody's the architect. It's just that all the suppliers are finding that if you've got operations in China and 3 other places, the operations in China are just winning hand over fist. I mean, to the extent that sometimes you're actually making money per product because the subsidies are so big rather than paying a few dollars each. This is where I talk about China really luring in lots of multinationals. And the problem there, the shift there is that the know-how, the experiential knowledge going from company to company is instead going from country to country. So there begins to be this massive divergence of interest between corporate America, in Apple's case, you could see Cupertino, and Washington. And because Cupertino is so big, I mean, it is not a fantasy to talk about Cupertino's foreign policy. I mean, they have their own interests, and they are sometimes different than Washington's. Sometimes they're diametrically opposed, to the extent that someone like Marco Rubio, as a senator, had to sort of threaten Apple with, what did he say, more scrutiny than from the federal government than Apple has ever seen in its history if they continued, training a Chinese chip maker. I always forget if it's YTMC or YMTC, because he said like this, you're up arming a Chinese entity in like the most important skill set like known to man, right? The ability to fabricate chips. So it basically forced Apple to stop. So the subtext there is just that Cupertino and Washington have wildly different foreign policies. So now you're fast forwarding to today. So I just wanted to give that bit of history. So I do think there's a lot of opposition, and I guess this is where I'd get to a line like Xi Jinping and Tim Cook actually have, broadly speaking, the same interests. In other words, it works very well for Tim Cook to have everything built in China. That's where you get still pretty good labor rates, abundant labor, cutting edge automation. We're leading logistics and infrastructure, and you're able to produce almost 500 million products per year. I mean, Apple is wildly successful in this respect, right? One of the craziest, I should just say the craziest statistic within Apple is no more than 20% market share of smartphones and more than 80% of the profits. I mean, pause the podcast to digest that and find me any other industry. Look at ChatGPT if you need to. You will not find any industry where a minority player commands profits on that sort of scale. And this is for the most iconic device of the 21st century. I mean, Apple is wild. Xi Jinping absolutely wants everything to be built in China because, to quote the epigraph to the book, without manufacturing, there is no country, there is no nation. This is how China thinks, and Apple is a massive supporter. Even the founder of Huawei has called Apple the teacher. So they have a wild congruence of interests. Donald Trump is more of a threat to Apple's operations than Xi Jinping. Donald Trump wants none of it built in China, if possible, and he wants a fast acceleration to somewhere like Pittsburgh or Ohio, on a timetable that really doesn't make any sense because I don't think he has a great understanding of supply chains, but he really wants to exert leverage against Tim Cook's interests and against Xi Jinping's interests. So there's a wild dichotomy between corporate America, in this case Apple, and national security interests of Washington. So I hope I'm getting at your answer there. I'm just trying not to do the crystal ball thing because I don't know what the future holds.
Yeah, no, of course. I think what it also sort of sets out is the fact that the MAGA movement is right in the sense that the national interests of the country are not aligned with the interests of certain large corporations, and I think that's true in Germany. That's true in a lot of places, and there was an interesting thought sort of that came to my mind. Once I completed your book, and it sort of led me back to Safi Bakal's book Loon Shots, which I found very insightful, and he basically sort of lays out how successful industrial policy looks, especially with high stakes and high urgency. And he speaks about how Vannevar Bush, who was dean of MIT, then goes to Roosevelt and sort of gets a lot of agency and power to modernize the American military because he kind of anticipates that they would have to enter the Second World War. And if the American military were not modernized, they would probably not win the war. And that's where sonar is born, and a whole bunch of other technologies that are super critical in winning the war. And sort of this, if trained in math and sort of working as a data and machine learning person all my career, I think I'll kind of try to find the underlying sort of first principles pattern. And I think one thing that I found very insightful was that what Vannevar Bush did was sort of centralize. So firstly, define a clear vision, centralize information and insights, and then sort of decentralize execution and sort of push agency down to smaller elements. Sounds very similar to the way China operates, right? From what you write in your book, which is Beijing sort of sets the vision and goals, but the provinces, the municipalities and counties implement them, right? And and I think it was Cheng Gang Shu, or I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, said it's a regionally decentralized authoritarian regime. And to sort of wrap this up, in your chapter, voluntary is the new mandatory. I think we're used to operating with rule of law, right? But China, in what you argue, operates with rule by law. So complete control with a clear vision, and then you just get that massive sort of market competitive energy in the execution.
Yeah, I mean, the reason the chapter is called "Voluntary is the New Mandatory." How great is that phrase? I'm stealing it from Jim McGregor. I mean, I cite him, but a businessman operating in China and wrote a book sort of around this period, 2013, I believe. I mean, it's because China sort of has constructed this system where wink wink arrangements become more the norm. So there will be certain laws that are federal, but the not the execution of those laws. What am I trying to say? The enforcement of
The
those laws,
implementation. Yeah.
implementation of those laws are local. And so what happens is, for instance, Apple sees this as a real threat, and Cupertino is confused by it. That I think it's in 2014, Beijing announces that it's going to have a new policy limiting the role of temp workers, what's called the labor dispatch system in China, to 10% of a sector or a company's workforce. Apple sometimes uses 80% temp workers in its factories, like indirectly its factories, right? Because the nature of Apple is you're not just building a certain number of iPhones per day, 365 days per year. You have spikes in demand when new products are launched. And in order for a factory to operate efficiently, they're using this floating labor force, right? This sort of migrant labor force that moves from factory to factory, from town to town, etc. This is where America just is never going to be competitive, because the number of people in the migrant labor force is literally larger than the labor force of the United States, and depending on how you count it, the actual population of the United States. So 300 million people or so. I mean, just a wild number of people, and they don't have the same rights as people that are born in the urban centers of China. You can go live in Shenzhen if you're born in Western China, but your kids can't go to school there, and you're deprived of certain welfare benefits. You're certainly not going to retire there. You have to go back to your village. So difficult to sort of replicate that model if you're wanting to learn from Chinese industrial policy, because it's not something that I would want to advocate. For I don't know, for India as the next great hope for manufacturing, for Germany, or certainly for America. I go off on all these tangents, and then I'm losing the thread on where I was trying to bring this back to. Remind me what we were talking about.
Yeah, no, I think it's this idea of centralizing the
Oh
vision,
yes, and
having a
regionally
clear vision,
decentralized.
clear interest, and then and then sort of decentralizing execution, and how irrespective of if you're socialist, capitalist, I think all those are meaningless labels. I think it's a certain way of executing with high agency towards a clear vision, sort of achieving that alignment.
Yes,
I think it's a structure that works. I think that's a pattern I see repeatedly,
but let me close the
and I
loop
just
on
want you to.
voluntary is the new mandatory. So what Apple would find out
Mhm.
is that the new law limiting 10% of your workforce to being temp workers wasn't actually a law that was supposed to be followed, right? And people in California are like, what do you mean it's not supposed to be followed? And, I quote an Apple executive in China who speaks Mandarin saying, you're supposed to figure out what the mayor of Zhengzhou wants from you. And so in a way, Apple's role in this, when the federal law is imposed, is to figure out who are the local officials that would enforce this law, and what favors can we do for them so that they don't enforce the law. That's what the
Yeah, what
rule
are their
by law
interests,
system
right?
is.
Yeah.
So rule of law
Hmm.
is creating an equal level playing field for all participants. Rule by law is the Chinese imposing a system wherein they hold the leverage, they have the power, and if you don't want to play with it, fine, exit China. See how good that's going to be for you. And so Apple realizes, okay, we're going to absolutely continue to use more than 10%, more than 50% of temp workers for our factories, but we're going to make such and such investments, right? Shows of being in China for China, such that that law will never be a threat over us. But of course, it's always kind of hanging there, right? So you're put in this funny position where Apple, the world's most valuable company, is having to sort of create favors for the Chinese state, hoping that it's enough and never knowing, is it enough? Right? And so, in the same way that like Apple's chief negotiator Tony Blevins would sort of put suppliers in a situation where they're hoping to get an Apple order, but Blevins will never say we need you to do it at such and such price, because if he sets it there, then he's limiting the prospect that they might actually deem a lower price what they are able to operate at, right? So instead of doing this is the same thing you do in a contract negotiation. Instead of saying I want to be paid $100,000, well, what if they were thinking 130? I mean, you just lost 30% of your salary. And so the skills that sort of Apple used against its suppliers were basically being used by the nation state against Apple in kind of fascinating full circle ways that demonstrate the sort of power of the Chinese state and how it's developed so quickly over the last 20 years.
Yeah, and I think this reflexivity is something that I saw really all across your book, which is the way Apple treats its suppliers is how China is treating Apple, basically, and every other company operating there.
Not only that, but there's this point in 2013 where Apple quickly learns, like, you're not going to treat Chinese officials the way you treat the suppliers, right? In other words, they think they just issue a little press release and say it's a misunderstanding, and there's a 3-week digital blitzkrieg until Tim Cook apologizes in Mandarin, and according to one source, and only one, this is why it's in parentheses, flies to China and kowtows.
Yeah, well, I just want to quickly riff around the yellow cow. Like, did you meet the yellow cow mob boss? Like, these guys seem to be like basically an unofficial hedge fund, right? They're doing all kinds of arbitrage, like with physical goods. I was like pretty impressed by how sophisticated they were.
Yeah, but I'm worried that the listener has no idea what we're talking about. So just to give like the 60-second version, and this is like 4 chapters in the book, and it's my favorite chapter in the book, so it sort of hurts my brain to do it so quickly. But effectively in 2010, the iPhone becomes the most conspicuous in-demand product that anybody in China could have, and people that can't afford it are taking out loans as high as 47% a year in order to acquire them. You know, you've got a mailman who
selling kidneys.
Someone sells kidneys. I mean, this is in Xinhua. This is in the state media that someone sells a kidney on the black market. You know, undergoes black market surgery in order to buy an iPad and an iPhone. You know, there's an example of a mailman who spends 30% of his annual salary to buy an iPhone. I mean, it's just hard to reconcile your sort of things like facts, like per capita GDP, with how gangbusters the iPhone becomes. And the yellow cows are these gangsters, in some cases backed by, you know, organized mafia triad networks, who recognize this imbalance and who want to buy as many iPhones with, you know, in a sealed box with an Apple Store receipt as possible, and then they go around the country selling them at these inflated prices because there's nobody else really selling them. They have a monopolist distribution on them. But they become more and more mixed up with organized crime. They become more and more greedy, and they find ways to basically like break the phones, rendering them inoperable, but masking the fact that they've been importing them illegally from the United States, where they're buying them, you know, with a 24-month contract, but using a fake ID where they're only paying 1 month of the 24. So like there's this whole like international scandal going on here, and the story is how Apple sort of wakes up to the reality. And aside from it just being fascinating, the reason why it's so part of the narrative is that this is a realization where Apple sees we don't understand Chinese culture. We don't understand Chinese politics. We don't understand our distribution problems. We need to have people on the ground that know this stuff and do this stuff and speak the language. And this is where they're able to sort of turn the tables on Beijing when they feel that their products are going to be blacklisted, and they begin to work out, as I say, sort of speak the local language and ingratiate themselves with provincial and federal officials. So it's a fascinating, wild, totally untold narrative, instrumental to why the book opens the way it does. And I feel like I solve a riddle as to why Apple gets attacked within 36 hours of Xi Jinping becoming president in March 2013. So read the book.
Yeah, but did you meet the yellow cows guy?
No, oh yeah, so sorry, that was all just the background. So no, I tell this story through the narrative of people that worked at Apple and people that worked at the U.S. Embassy, because their security concerns are such that the embassy gets involved on multiple occasions, the embassy in Beijing. Did I meet any of the Louis Vuitton holding yellow cows who controls the networks? No, I did not. That would be amazing. Okay. If any yellow cows are listening, feel free to get in contact.
Yeah, I think then before we wrap up, I just have one point which I found very, very sort of insightful, which is where you quote Yi Wen, and he says, you know, tacit knowledge around basically how people produce, distribute, travel, communicate, and consume is what created Britain, you know, as a colonial power, as a global power, and you know, not democracy and property rights and all of that. And I think it makes a lot of sense to me. I think that's a much more solid argument. And you know that basically China was trying to acquire this tacit knowledge, to then use it for its own interests. And just to quick anecdote here. In 2000, was it 18? I was or 17. I was in Berlin, and I went to the Hertie school, where they have policy discussions, and it was around, what's China like, what kind of Cold War is China involved in, and there was a South American guy who got up and said, "Look, it's not a Cold War; it's a hot war. Like, they really, the gloves are off basically in certain regions. Not in Europe, perhaps not in the U.S., but there are regions where the gloves are off. And being born in India, I got up and said, "Hey, look, they have seen hot, like, there's been hot war in the region. So it's not as if it's a Cold War." And there's a professor a Chinese professor who was visiting Berlin, one of the universities in Berlin. He got up and he says, very politely, "I want to disagree with my Indian friend here." And, basically we're doing what the British did, right? We're essentially a mercantilist global power. That's our ambition. That's what we want to do.
Yep.
And that's it. There is no foul play, etc. So do you want to sort of unpack this? That, like, how do you actually become? How do you gain more power and more global power through tacit knowledge, and sort of riff on this China versus Britain sort of building up their power? What's going on there, and your own sort of experiences, anecdotes?
I know you posted some of this on LinkedIn, and you used sort of favorite quote of mine in the book from the late Harvard historian David Landes, who says something along the lines of, "Trade in commodities might be big, but it's small in comparison to trade in ideas." And that, in a way,
Correct.
is what Apple is trying to convince Beijing of 2015, 2016, to sort of give them the sense of experiential know-how and how much it means. So stop paying attention to the low margins, start paying attention to what we're teaching you. And I think that's largely what America has lost over the last 75 years. We have, as to quote Andy Grove, we have devalued the importance of manufacturing. We used to talk about Detroit being the arsenal of democracy, right? There was this sense, and we're getting the sense now with, Iran versus Israel or Ukraine versus Russia, that it really matters if you can build stuff. But building stuff well isn't just something you learn overnight. It's decades of investment. It's decades of experiential know-how and build-up. And the quote that opens the book, in addition to the Made in China one, is from David Landes. And I'll let people go read it rather than say it by memory, because I don't know it by memory. But it's basically just that the argument that Britain's ability to make stuff and the tacit knowledge of all of that is what leads to it becoming the workshop of the world, right? Something we associate with China today, but was associated with Britain in the 18th century and earlier. And it's what leads to the Industrial Revolution and the British Empire. So I'm really just trying to set out the stakes as immediately as I can, that Apple and indeed the West sort of sending all of our manufacturing, devaluing it and sending it over to low margin assemblers in China has played a real geopolitical role. So the book goes into more detail as to sort of why that is. And Yi Wen wrote this great book. It's not maybe greatly written, I should say, but what's in there, I think, is great. I believe it's called The Making of a Superpower, and the subtitle something like Unlocking the Secrets of China's Rise. There is a shorter PDF that you can actually just download from the Federal Reserve website. He's Chinese born, but he works, or at least worked, at the St. Louis Federal Reserve, I believe. But it's also a book in longer form. And he's how I found out about David Landes. He quotes him all the time. And yeah, he just basically thinks, like too many Westerners think, the value of the Industrial Revolution was based on Britain's property rights, and indeed even the evolution of human rights. And he says, like, no, it was all about the buildup of these tacit knowledge-based industrial clusters. And so when Apple is trying to convince the Chinese government, there's a big play here. We're a massive supporter of indigenous innovation. Indeed, and this is my language, we are the biggest supporter of Made in China 2025. This is why it's music to the ears of Beijing officials.
Yeah, and now to wrap up, what you're basically saying is what J.D. Vance sort of said at the Andreessen Horowitz conference, right? Which is around, we thought we could let other people make it, etc. But, with that, we lose the ability to really, by outsourcing to get cheaper goods, we basically devalue our own skills. We kind of, essentially sacrifice our national interests, and we make adversity stronger. So just your thoughts on that, but then the consequence of acting on that, right? You speak about how hard it was. I think a factory in Texas where they had to fly down engineers from Foxconn in China or in Taiwan,
Yeah.
and like how hard it is to move stuff back to the US, and then especially Vietnam and India, because they're being sort of touted as the next places. If it doesn't work in the US or in Europe, then at least it'll be some other place, for example like India and Vietnam. And for India, you have some crazy statistics, which is that out of 290,000 China has 290,000 industrial robots. India has like less than 6,000, and that iPhones made in India are assembled in China, disassembled there, and then sent to India for reassembly. So yeah, like how do we move it back? Like if we want to move it back, how does that turn out?
Yeah, so let me just say, I don't think I have much political similarity with JD Vance, but on this point, I'll agree. We seem to have the same view there. The difference is what to do about the problem, right? The Trump administration might very well have diagnosed the problem correctly, but I'm not a big fan of their solutions. I mean, I want to see 21st century industrial policy, not 18th century tariffs. And I'm in favor of, sort of the Pax Americana integrationist world, right? There's this phrase I like where commerce doesn't cross borders, armies do. And I am a big fan of sort of post-war America, having 50% of global manufacturing, but realizing if we actually want to have a peaceful world, it's going to be in our own interests to train young German men in the post-Nazi era and do the same for Germany and do the same for Korea, Taiwan, all these countries. And I think America plays a pretty starring role, creating a fairly peaceful period. I mean, some people would say it's pretty unprecedented in world history to have that 75-year period. Obviously, there are some wars, but they're not really wars between the countries I'm talking about. And there's something, there's a selfish element to it. There's something like a selfish element to the Marshall Plan of, helping countries so that they buy more Levi's and Coca-Cola. I understand that. But there's also a remarkably unselfish internationalist outlook for it as well. And that's what I would want to steer towards. So I don't think iPhones are going to be made in Pittsburgh or Texas anytime soon, but I do think they could be made if Apple makes the right investments and New Delhi is interested enough in India. Um, the fact that India is more of an ally than than China really matters to me. The fact that Mexico is on the American border really matters to me. I would like to see more electronics production and Apple production in those countries as opposed to China. That's not an easy move. That's something that will take 15 years. But I think if it's at the highest level of political discussion, it could happen. And I don't see Apple making the sort of moves that I would like them to do. To be clear, more could be
But
happening than is visible. Go ahead.
I think, as you argue, right, Apple is essentially reacting to the chessboard it is, or like the board it is put on. So it has to be industrial policy that allows this 15-year transition, because just shareholder capitalism, as you point out, or quarterly earnings is not going to result in this, right? If you want these supply chains to change, you need coordinated industrial policy between Washington, between New Delhi, and others, because it's not going to happen on its own, and the market is not going to fix this problem, because I think very clearly, sort of the subtext in what your book is that the market created this problem, and obviously the market cannot fix it. You need something more overarching. You need to take a step back and think more strategically.
Yeah, I don't say this, but you could very much say that there was a market failure that resulted in the rise of China as an economic superpower. I mean, that is sort of the unspoken subtext of the book. That's why I think it was earlier that I said on the call, there's no villains in my narrative, but if it's an indictment, it's against shareholder first capitalism, because that's the doctrine that basically says, per Milton Friedman 50 years ago, profit is the only thing a business needs to worry itself with. It doesn't need to concern itself with societal interests. Profit is the goal. And if that's the goal, you outsource everything to a country with low human rights, low cost, low environmental standards, and so forth. And China has reaped the benefit of that more than anybody else.
Yeah, I think just to bring some nuance there, I think uh, uh, the objective of a corporation can be to make profit, but then you still need just that on its own in the wild is not enough, right? I think that's what, for me, is what your book communicated. If you have an overarching industrial policy, a set of national interests, a certain North Star, a vision, a guiding framework, right, then within that the market works well, because like you also argue, right, or like, a whole bunch of people who've written on China and lived in China, it's extremely competitive, right? There is a strong market dynamic there, but there is an overarching thought and strategy and direction. And I think if you have that, then sort of Milton Friedman works okay. The problem is if you argue for just that Milton Friedman dynamic, then you're in trouble. Then you get screwed.
If the net result of my book is more people are having the conversation about what you just said in the last 60 seconds, I'll consider it a massive win.
Yeah, me too. I think that for me that was really the biggest take home, is like it's not market or no market, or all these sort of non-new or sort of lack of nuance binaries that people keep discussing ad infinitum. I think it's much more about being extremely pragmatic and understanding how do you make, like, how do you put up the right framework and incentives so that we're all happy? I mean, in sort of
Yeah.
the broadest sense.
And if I could convince one thing to anyone listening or watching, it's just that, like, we're really just scratching the surface of what's in the book, and we're really talking about the conclusions to the book. But there's all sorts of characters I don't think that we've mentioned, and it's really like a character-driven book. And I did my best to make it sort of like a gripping thriller-like thing. So despite it sounding like it's about supply chains and investing or whatever, it's really like a fast-paced narrative spanning continents and decades with all these interesting characters, sort of figuring this out as they go. So I'm always concerned that people think, oh, that's an interesting podcast, but I think I understand the nature of the book, and like I just want to emphasize, like, there's so much more in the book.
Yeah, no, well, I just finished reading the book, and for whatever it's worth, I can only recommend you read it, because what I try to do here is distill sort of some key elements I think that are important and that I wanted to sort of unpack with Patrick. But I think the book on its own is an insane artifact, because like you just said, it's written like a story. You see you see the obsession about detail, I think, and what you just described about your college essay. That's why I want to get better, because you clearly see that in the book, right? Even though you don't know the author when you read the book, that comes across. There's a whole bunch of characters. Like, I can't even remember the name. That's the amount of characters that get sort of detailed out, and sort of their life stories are put out there, and it's fascinating. And you see how they come in, they go out. You see how Patrick sort of characterizes them, especially the head of I think it was the VP China of Apple, and it's just insane how when you read Patrick's book, you go like, okay, from the outside it looks like she has all the title and all of that, but at the end of the day she's actually a nobody as far as what Apple in China has to do. I think of what I found super funny was about, I think, the senior executive leading the charge in India, where you basically say, colleagues, you quote colleagues saying, she's super hardworking, and if hard work were the answer, then it will, then she's the right person, or it will result in success, otherwise not. And I think sort of, it's like this bull charging, this sort of, this almost hustle porn, of like, you just have to work harder and things will work out. I think I really love when people deconstruct that and say, look, sometimes just thinking for a few minutes is worth, hours of work. And,
Right.
and I think that I found quite fascinating, where you realize sometimes it's, if you put on your blinkers and just run like a thoroughbred in the wrong direction, you're basically jumping off the cliff, right?
Yeah. To be clear, I'm not trying to be biting about Priya Balasubramaniam there.
Of course,
I
yeah.
don't know what the answer is for what they need to do in India.
Correct.
So yeah, she might be the right person if it requires such skill set. If it requires a different skill set, then maybe she's not the right person. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot. There's less argument in the book than you think. There's a lot of showing rather than telling. And I hope people can make up their own minds about any number of issues that are in the book. But if the book just starts the conversation or makes people feel like they're part of the conversation, then that would be amazing.
Yeah, and I think a lot of other people who read the book also say it's very gripping. I think once you get started, you really want to go through to the end, and I think that's credit to you, Patrick, as an author. I think you've been able to sort of it's almost like a thriller novel. I think that is sort of really baked into the book.
Yeah.
And Guthrie is sort of one of the characters I really enjoy. I just want to put in, get people a bit more interested without revealing too much. But like, you're going to love I personally loved Guthrie as a character, Ford as a character. So there are all these people. I don't even remember their full names, but like, fascinating people. Uncle Terry, of course, and how he bought a castle in the Czech Republic. And I was in the Czech Republic just after reading the book, and I was like, did I pass by Uncle Terry's castle here? So
It's public. You can find it on the internet. I mean, there were times I think you could even rent it out. But
Yeah, no, so there are a lot of interesting things. Read the book. I think just the last thing, just to wrap up in 2 minutes, Patrick, what's your disagreement with the status quo, and why did you write this book?
So I've really got to go. I'm late for another call, so I don't know that I can answer it fully. I would just say that the next big thing in technology is AI, and because ChatGPT is illegal in China, coupled with Siri being a pretty bad product, 10 years out of date at this stage, Apple has to work with Chinese partners to make it happen. And so in China. And so the prospect Apple currently faces is that instead of just training up the next generation of hardware engineers in China, Apple's going to have to be training up the next generation of AI software engineers to make its products world leading in China. I think that's a scary prospect. So I'll just put that there. That would be the status quo, and I think on a business level, it's an unbreakable connection that Apple has with China. Politically, I think it's untenable.
Thanks, Patrick. That was a lovely conversation.
Okay, yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much.